Hello friends, my name's Emile and welcome back to another edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. Today we're taking a look at some cars from the United States of America. We begin with the 2017 Ford GT, 647 horsepower, 550 foot-pound torque, 3,148 pounds of weight. The lightest car here today, however, it is not the most powerful or the most torquey, although it does have the best power to weight ratio here today. The 2017 Ford GT, a car that I do rather like because it is very, very purposeful. We'll get into that in a second. I always thought the 2005 Ford GT was a little more than a nostalgia piece. It was a good looking car, it made a nice noise, but it didn't really have, for me, the ability to really overcome cars like the Ferrari 430. The Ford GT, however, is a very, very serious contender in the supercar game. In fact, I would probably say this is one of the best supercars in the world right now. It is fantastic. This really is an absolutely amazing car to drive. It handles like God, it has a good amount of speed, good amount of acceleration, really very, very solid car to drive. Probably, in my eyes, the best supercar to drive. I can't think of any more that drive as well as the Ford GT does. It is an incredible, incredible, incredible machine. I do urge you all to go drive it. If you haven't already, it's a pretty popular car, I'd imagine, but yeah, go drive the 2017 Ford GT, it is amazing. However, the car that won't really shock you is the 2015 Dodge Challenger Hellcat, 707 horsepower, 650 foot-pound torque, 4,458 pounds of weight. It is the most powerful car here today, and the torquiest car here today. It's also a very, very heavy car. We'll get into that later. Yes, of course, the magical Hellcat, the 707 horsepower, just God. It's really very, very silly. It is, well, I mean, for all intents and purposes, the current Challenger and Charger run on a 28-year-old Mercedes platform, and you're putting 707 horsepower into it. How do you think it's going to drive? It's not as bad as you'd think. It's still not very good though. One prevailing factor of this car is you can feel the weight in this thing. It feels so unbelievably heavy to drive. You know, 4,438 pounds, you'd sort of expect that, but honestly, this isn't the heaviest car here today. It feels like it is though. It feels stupidly heavy. But, I mean, rear-wheel drive, as you'd expect, don't push your luck, and it isn't too bad. It handles like you'd expect a muscle car to, which is a bit strange when you consider, you know, the likes of Chevrolet and Ford are really sort of focusing more on handling parts. I like how Dodge has basically turned around and said, let's just have all the power like we did back in the 60s. Speaking of those cars, this is the 2012 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, 580 horsepower, 557 foot-pound of torque, 4,051 pounds of weight. This is not the most recent ZL1, however it is my favourite, and we'll get on to why in a second. I'm not a fan of the Chevrolet Camaro, you might know this, really not a fan of it. However, the ZL1 is a pretty impressive car. You look at the figures, 580 horsepower, over 4,000 pounds of weight. You'd expect this thing to be, well, drive like a dialed down Hellcat. However, it is amazing to drive. It is an absolutely fantastic car to drive. It's almost flawless in my eyes. It gets turned in well. You can jump on the power pretty much whenever, and it won't really make a fuss about it. That's 580 horsepower going to the rear wheels, but it doesn't bother. You know, it's fine with it. You can abuse it, basically. It is an extremely impressive car to drive. I haven't really driven the 2017, although if it's anything like this, that will be a very, very quick car. Yeah, I love the 2012 Camaro. It's a fantastic car, and I implore you to drive it. I know this one probably doesn't get used too much, but go and drive the 2012 Camaro, you'll love it. Anyways, next up, 2014 Jeep Grand Cherokee, 470 horsepower, 465 foot-pound torque, 5,150 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest car here today. Of course, we couldn't do an American episode without featuring one very, very large SUV, and in this case, we do use the 2014 version of the Grand Cherokee, a soccer mobile turned into a raging beast. It is not the Trackhawk. It's still a pretty insane vehicle though. I mean, you know, putting 470 horsepower through a Jeep is a lot, especially considering I'm assuming this car for the most part comes with 200, 300 horsepower maybe. Interestingly enough, it is actually surprisingly decent. Ever since Forza Motorsport 5, SUVs have been getting better and better to drive, and the Jeep certainly proves that. If you drove this in Forza 4, it would fall over. But with the fact that you can't really roll the cars over as easy anymore, and they changed the physics around, these things are nowhere near as understeer as they previously was. Do not get me wrong, it is not a perfect car to drive. There is a lot of understeer, a fair amount of body roll actually. I drove this straight after the Camaro, and it really did take a good couple of minutes, good couple of laps to really get used to driving it. But once you're used to them, they're not actually that bad to drive, or they basically drive like pumped up hot hatches. So yeah, they're a pretty good breed of vehicle. Next up, 2016 Cadillac ATS-V, 464 horsepower, 444 foot-pound of torque, 3,700 pounds of weight. This thing actually weighs a lot less than I was expecting a Cadillac to. Yeah, interestingly enough, for a Cadillac as well, it actually appears to be a manual in-game, which is something I was not expecting. The ATS-V, I actually did quite like the ATS-V. The previous generations of CTS have sort of been up and down for me. You know, you have some really good-looking ones like the sedan, and then the wagon looked a little bit weird. The coupe looked very, very weird. I really didn't like the coupe, and I didn't particularly like the way either of them really drove. But the ATS is basically a toned down version of the CTS. It's the baby brother to it, and I do have to say, for all intents and purposes, it is a better driving car than the CTS. I drove the CTS back in Forza Motorsport 6. I found it very tricky to deal with. The gearbox in that car is pretty horrendous, but this has a lovely 6-speed manual, so that's fine. If I had to say something about this car, I've got to be honest, it's a little bit bland, because it is a very neutral driving car. It's very hard to really say what's about it. You know, it's a good car to drive, don't get me wrong, but it's not the most interesting car to drive. It's not exactly something I'd turn around to go have a nice hoon and a bit of fun in. It's not that sort of car. Next up, 1987 Buick Regal, a GNX, 300 horsepower, 380 foot-pound of torque, 3,545 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful and least torquey car here today, so that shows you how much power we have in this American episode when the most powerful car, or least powerful car, is 300 horsepower. That's pretty good. Yes, the car's now shifting gears, getting in some of the older cars in this episode. And yes, we have the 87 Buick Regal, a car which many people hail as one of the defining gems of the American car industry, certainly one of the bright spots in the otherwise pretty drab 80s was the Grand National. Of course, basically, if you don't know what this is it's a Buick Regal with a massive turbocharger on it, and yeah, it's an interesting vehicle to drive, certainly. It's very rolly, I will say that much. It rolls on the suspension a lot. Of course, this is an 80s car, it's an 80s luxury coupe technically, or at least it was. So it's got very, very soft, nice GM suspension, and yeah, that does mean it does have a fair bit of rolling in the corners. It's not a bad car to drive though, certainly. It's not as bad as it used to be. The Buick used to be a little bit weird to drive, because it's sort of, every time you change gear, it sort of clunked and banged, and it didn't really get up to speed particularly well because the gears were so long. It doesn't really seem to have that much problem with it anymore. It's still not a particularly fast gearbox, but it's not a terrible one, and yeah, the Buick is actually a lot better to drive now. Next up, a car that screams America. This is the 1970 AMC Rebel, also known as the Machine. 340 horsepower, 427 foot-pound of torque, 3,650 pounds of weight. A lot more torque than you'd expect in a car like this. Yeah, the AMC Rebel, a car I do quite like. It's one of the sillier muscle cars of its day. It has the rev limiter on the hood for some reason, don't know why. Some American cars have that, and this is one of those. Yeah, the AMC Rebel is basically a toned down version of AMC's Javelin, similar to the CTS ATS dynamic. Although, in my opinion, the Rebel is a little bit more interesting than the Javelin was. The Javelin doesn't really get used very much anymore. Very, very underutilized car. I doubt many people even remember it's still in Forza. But the Rebel is kind of cool. As far as it drives, it is very much a typical muscle car. You can sort of see it rolling around, getting a little bit sideways. It drives like you'd expect a 60s, 70s American muscle car to do so. But it isn't terrible. It has actually a really decent gearbox. I'm mentioning gearboxes a lot in this episode because that's usually the one thing I find with American cars that usually lacks quite a bit. This one, really quick gear ratios. First gear is really long, like race car long. but after that it has pretty good ratios. I'm assuming that's drag racing related perhaps, but yeah, it's actually a fairly decent gearbox, which I wasn't expecting to say when it came to this car. Although, if we're talking about the unexpected, we have to speak about our final car. This is the 1969 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, 345 horsepower, 430 foot-pound of torque, 3,306 pounds of weight. That's very, very light, actually. I didn't realise it was that light until I just read that number out. Jesus Christ. Yes, the Trans Am Firebird, a very, very cool car, of course. Everyone loves a good Pontiac Firebird. Of course, they did end up dropping off a little bit, but yeah, back in the day, these things were pretty darn cool, and this one certainly is one of those. However, it is not the good looks or the noise or anything like that that I'm impressed with by the Firebird. It's the way it drives. It is surprisingly nimble. I was not expecting to say that. The steering, I drove this after the Rebel, so maybe I'm being sort of a little bit treated by the Firebird, but the steering is really quick. It's really precise. It's, yeah, as I said, it's a really nimble car to drive. It actually gets pretty stuck to the road as well. It's a really solid choice when it comes to muscle cars. You know, if you're sort of struggling a little bit with muscle cars, you know, maybe you're driving some of the worst off ones, get yourself in this Firebird, and you'll find it's a really good handling car. It's, yeah, it's almost like adjusting from some of the older European sports cars into this. You can adjust really well into it. It's a really very, very good vehicle, is the Trans Am. Anyways, on to the leaderboards, and unsurprisingly, the Ford GT is the fastest car today. It goes into third place with a 113.179, which is really very, very quick. It is a second quicker than the 997 generation GT2 RS. It's quicker than an Enzo Viper ACR. It is slightly slower than a Nissan R390, but that's still a very, very quick time from the GT. Moving down once more, the Camaro ZL1 goes into 28th place with 119.721. I told you that car was quick. It almost beats an Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale, which is one of the best cars in the game. It is faster than a Ferrari 288 GTO, BMW M3, Ferrari 250 LM. Excellent car, go drive it. Moving down once again, Challenger Hellcat goes into 36th place with 122.038, which actually isn't as bad as I was expecting it to be. A little bit slower than a Lotus Evora, quicker than an Audi RS5 Coupe A. The Cadillac ATS goes into 39th place with 122.632. Not really too much to compare it to around that time zone. It's quicker than an old SVT Cobra R, quicker than an old Honda NSX. It's quicker than a Maserati Gran Turismo, but not really a lot of comparison cars around it. Jeep Grand Cherokee goes into 55th place with 126.236. You know, I said it handled like a hot hatch. Yeah, it is 200th of a second off of a Golf R, which sort of proves my point. The Buick Regal GNX goes into 58th place with 127.173. It's not actually that much slower than a Ferrari 365 Daytona. It's quicker than a G65 AMG, Megane RS250, a Sierra Cosworth. That's actually a decently quick time from the Regal. Moving down again, Firebird Trans Am goes into 71th place with a 129.750, making it quicker than an RX-7 FC. It is slightly slower than a Fox Body Cobra, but that isn't bad considering there is a good chunk of years between those cars. And finally, slowest car today, unsurprisingly, was the AMC Rebel. Goes into 73rd place with 130.813. Does make it quicker than Mitsubishi Eclipse, Supra Legacy, and a Lancia Fulvia, but just not a hugely quick car, but we wasn't really expecting it to be. Anyways, friends, that is it for this episode of Forza Top Gear Laps. I do hope you've enjoyed. Next time, I'm going to be taking a look at another region-based episode. I'm going to be looking at Japanese cars. Join me for that. Until then, friends, thank you for watching, and farewell.
Friends, neighbors, ladies, gentlemen, if you're feeling underpowered, I'll help you make amends. Stick your weapon in the slot and let it change your luck. Few things in life are guaranteed, but I promise this won't suck. Punch your fists into the air and raise a rebel yell.